The bright, frantic months of spring and summer were for farming, fishing, raiding, trading, and traveling, for building up the resources that would be their lifeline. Then, as the light began to fail and the air took on its first serious bite, the world contracted. The horizon shrank from the vastness of the North Sea to the walls of the home field, and then, finally, to the timber and turf walls of the long house itself. The Vikings retreated into a state of near hibernation, a strategic pulling in of horns, where the entire focus of life shifted inward, from the global to the local, from the community to the family, from the body politic to the simple animal need to stay warm. So, as we begin this exploration, try to shed the image of the Viking as only a conqueror. See them also as a hibernator, a strategist of thermodynamics, a master of layering, both in wool and in social structure. Their greatest victory was not necessarily won on a battlefield, but repeated every single night in the dark from November to March, when the temperature outside dropped to absolutely naught, and they had to find a way, once again, to see the dawn. In the following sections, we will dissect this survival system piece by piece. We will venture inside the iconic longhouse to understand its secrets as a thermal battery. We will unravel the complex, life-saving technology of the Viking wardrobe, a full-body suit of armor against the cold. We will open their winter larders and examine the dense, preserved, and sometimes terrifying foods that powered them. We will look at the radical, pragmatic intimacy of their living arrangements, where humans and animals became a single, warm-blooded collective. We will confront the grim trade-offs of smoke and sanitation. And finally, we will delve into the mental and spiritual tools they used to fight off the despair that could be as deadly as any frost. This is the story of how the Vikings faced the cold. It's a story of engineering without blueprints, of medicine without textbooks, of psychology without therapists. It is ultimately the story of how they turned their greatest vulnerability, the relentless killing winter, into one of their core strengths. The crucible that forged them was not just fire and iron, but ice and darkness. And it all started with the place they called home. Not just a house, but a fortress against the freeze. The longhouse.
When the wind began to howl with a serious intent, a sound that promised to flay the skin from your bones, the Viking world shrank. It shrank from the vastness of the fjord and the forest, down to the boundaries of the farm, and then, decisively, to the thick, squat silhouette of the longhouse. This was not merely a building, it was a lifeboat in a frozen sea, a hibernal fortress, a triumph of pragmatic engineering over an environment that was, for months at a time, actively hostile to human life. To modern eyes, a Viking longhouse might seem primitive, a dark, smoky, and crowded shed, and it was. But it was a shed designed with one overriding, non-negotiable purpose: to retain every single ounce of heat generated within its walls. This was architecture dictated not by aesthetics, but by sheer, brutal necessity. Every aspect of its design, from its orientation to the material stuffed into its walls, was a calculated response to the cold. The location and foundation were the first line of defense. Long houses were often situated with a careful eye to the landscape, tucked into slight rises or sheltered by tree lines to break the worst of the wind. They were built low to the ground, a sprawling, horizontal presence that minimized the surface area exposed to the elements. Unlike a tall, narrow structure that would be battered by winds and lose heat rapidly, the longhouse hugged the earth, drawing what little geothermal warmth it could from the ground itself. The foundations were made of stone, sometimes just large field stones laid in a trench, creating a solid, damp-resistant base that kept the timber walls from rotting directly into the soil. The walls themselves were a masterpiece of vernacular engineering. In forested regions, they were built using a sturdy timber frame, often of oak if available, with the spaces between the vertical posts filled with wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches, wattle, plastered over with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, daub. This created a surprisingly solid and wind-proof barrier. But in places like Iceland, where trees were a rarity, the Vikings displayed their trademark adaptability. They built their longhouses out of turf. They would erect a simple inner frame of driftwood or scant imported timber, and then stack thick blocks of turf, grass, soil, and all, like gigantic bricks, creating walls that could be several feet thick. A turf wall was not just a wall, it was a part of the landscape itself, a living, breathing insulator with phenomenal thermal mass. It absorbed moisture and slowly released it. Held fibrous structure was incredibly effective at stopping the wind and holding in heat. And then there was the stuffing. In the inevitable gaps and cracks that appeared between logs or in the wattle, the Vikings stuffed whatever they could find that was fibrous, abundant, and free. Moss was a prime candidate. Harvested in great damp sheets from the surrounding forests, it was packed tightly into crevices. It was lightweight, plentiful, and its cellular structure trapped countless tiny pockets of air, creating a primitive but effective form of insulation. Animal hair, left over from wool processing or butchering, was another common choice, as was straw and dry ferns. The goal was to create a sealed envelope to stop the drafts that could kill as surely as a blade. You didn't want to lean against these walls on a cold morning. The damp chill would seep right through your clothes. But that same property meant the cold outside struggled to get in.
The roof was the crowning glory of this thermal strategy. A thatched roof of reeds or straw was good, but a sod roof was better. A layer of turf laid over birch bark or boards created a massive, heavy insulating blanket over the entire household. It was excellent for heat retention and decent at shedding water, though it could get waterlogged in a thaw. The weight was immense, requiring a powerfully built roof structure, but the payoff was a stable internal temperature. Under the right conditions, it might even sprout weeds or mushrooms, an accidental bit of indoor gardening. The roof also featured the building's most critical and problematic feature, the smoke hole. The heart of the longhouse, both literally and figuratively, was the long central hearth. This was not a cozy fireplace in the corner. It was a trench running down the center of the main hall, the literal and symbolic spine of the home. It served as the kitchen stove, the furnace, the light source, and the social hub. Here all cooking was done, in iron pots or cauldrons suspended over the flames, or in embers buried at the fire's edge. The fire was banked and tended carefully, but it was rarely allowed to go out completely. Restarting a fire from scratch in the depths of winter with damp tinder was a difficult and dangerous task. But this life-giving fire came with a significant cost: smoke. The longhouse had no chimney. The concept of a dedicated, efficient flue was known in some parts of the world, but not here, not in these timber and turf structures. Instead, the smoke from the hearth was intended to rise, drift along the underside of the roof, and find its way out through one or more holes left in the roof for that purpose. This was the theory. In practice, the reality was far smokier. The smoke would collect in the rafters, a thick, swirling, acrid cloud that slowly seeped out through the thatch or turf. It clung to everything, blackening the roof timbers with a thick, tarry layer of soot that, ironically, helped preserve the wood from insects and rot. The air inside was thick, experienced. You didn't just see the haze, you tasted it, you breathed it. Your eyes watered constantly. Your lungs, over a lifetime, would take on the character of a smoked ham. The historian Ibn Fadlan, encountering Vikings on the Volga, noted with disgust their grimy appearance, a direct result of this smoky environment. It was unhealthy, uncomfortable, and unavoidable. But it was also, in a strange way, useful. The smoke helped to cure and preserve meats and fish hung from the rafters for storage, and it acted as a potent insect repellent, keeping bugs and parasites at bay. The interior layout was a direct reflection of the need for thermal efficiency. The longhouse was typically one large open room, or sometimes divided into a main hall and a smaller storage or stable area at one end. There were no private bedrooms, no separate living spaces. Along the walls were raised wooden platforms stacked with layers of straw, moss, and animal furs. These were the sleeping benches, and they were the designated sleeping areas for the entire household. Parents, children, grandparents, and even important guests. Everyone slept side by side, a human tapestry of shared body heat. This was not for intimacy, but for thermodynamics. It was community engineering on a nightly basis. The floor was usually just packed earth, sometimes covered with a layer of rushes or straw that would be replaced periodically. Periodically meaning when the smell of trampled food, mud, and animal droppings became too potent to ignore. Windows, if they existed at all, were nothing more than small, shuttered openings, perhaps covered with a scrap of greased animal membrane to let in a faint, greasy light while blocking the wind. Glass was a luxury for kings and churches, not for a farmer in Norway. Why have a large window? It was a hole that let in cold and let out heat, and for months of the year, the view was just darkness anyway. In wealthier longhouses, or in later periods, you might find a partitioned-off area at one end, the dingya, which was often the women's working area for textile production. It was a slightly more private and likely somewhat warmer space, but for the vast majority, life was lived in the Great Hall, in a state of constant, smoky, cramped togetherness. The longhouse was, in essence, a communal thermal battery. The heat from the fire, the body heat of dozens of people, and often the body heat of the livestock, all contributed to charging this battery. It was a slow cooker of humanity, a survival cuddle bunker that, for all its discomforts and indignities, worked. It kept people alive through nights when the world outside was a frozen wasteland, a place where exposure meant a swift and certain death. It was the heart of their winter world, and from this warm, if foul heart, all other survival strategies flowed.
A tired, defeated old man. If the longhouse was the fortress, then the Vikings' personal clothing was their suit of armor. This was a battle fought on the skin, a daily mobile war against a cold that could freeze flesh in minutes. Viking fashion was a discipline born of desperation, a sartorial science where aesthetics were irrelevant and the only metric that mattered was thermal retention. It was less about looking good and more about not having your fingers turn black and fall off before you could chop the morning firewood. The cornerstone, the absolute non-negotiable foundation of this system, was wool. In the Viking world, gold was wealth, silver was status, but wool was life. It was their primary, most versatile, and most effective weapon against the elements. Unlike linen or cotton, which become cold, clinging liabilities when wet, wool possesses a miraculous property. It retains its insulating capacity even when damp. When your world is one of freezing fog, sleet, melting snow on your shoulders, and your own perspiration from labor, this wasn't just a handy feature. It was the difference between life and death. Every stage of wool production was a critical survival skill, predominantly the work of women. From the moment a sheep was shorn, the clock was ticking to transform that raw, greasy fleece into a protective layer. The wool would be cleaned, carded, brushed to align the fibers, and then spun into yarn using a drop spindle. This was not a pastime. It was a constant, year-round necessity. In the winter, by the dim firelight, the act of spinning was literally the act of weaving the future's warmth. Every length of yarn was a thread in the fabric of your family's survival. This yarn was then woven on upright looms into the cloth that would become everything. The base layer for most people was a woolen tunic worn by both men and women. For men, this was paired with woolen trousers, but here, the Viking genius for practical layering truly shone. They didn't just wear trousers, they used leg wraps. These were long, narrow strips of woolen cloth, meticulously wound from the ankle to the knee, effectively creating a seamless, multi-layered thermal legging that kept the wind out and the heat in. It was a simple, brilliant solution to the problem of a cold, drafty gap between boot and trouser. Over this, a Viking woman would wear a suspended woolen dress, often with an apron dress over it, creating yet another layer of trapped air. A man would wear a thicker, heavier tunic, and everyone wore a cloak. The cloak was the most vital piece of outerwear, a wearable blanket that was your main defense when away from the hearth. It was fastened with a brooch, a practical piece of jewelry that could be a simple bone pin or an elaborate bronze or silver disc, proclaiming your status even in your desperation to stay warm. Cloaks were often made of a thicker, oilier wool that was more water-resistant, and the wealthier could line them with fur for superior insulation. Now, let's talk about the extremities, because that's where frostbite strikes first. Headwear was essential. Men and women wore caps of felted wool or knitted null binding, a single needle looping technique that produced a thick, dense fabric. Mittens, similarly made, were crucial. If you didn't have mittens, You would simply shove your hands into the folds of your cloak or under your armpits and hope for the best. Scarves were used to protect the neck and face. The goal was to leave no skin exposed to the air.
Footwear was a masterpiece of pragmatic, if pungent, design. Viking boots were not sleek. They were essentially sacks of leather designed to keep water out. Made from cattle hide, or in coastal areas, seal skin, they were cut using a single piece of leather, turn shoes, to minimize seams where water could seep in. But the real secret was the waterproofing. They were generously slathered in animal fat, fish oil, or tar. You didn't just polish these boots, you re-greased them, creating a barrier that was remarkably effective against wet snow and slush. The downside was olfactory. A Viking household, and by extension a Viking person, would have carried with them the distinct, rich aroma of a tannery and a smoked fish shop. But when the alternative is trench foot and frostbite, you learn to love the smell. But the Vikings took weatherproofing to a level that can still shock the modern sensibility. For the truly dedicated, for those who had to face the worst of the North Sea spray or a blizzard on a hunting trip, there was an option that stands as a testament to their utter lack of squeamishness: gut-skin clothing. Yes, actual animal intestines. The process was as gruesome as it sounds. The intestines of a sheep or seal would be carefully removed, cleaned, scraped, and then stretched and dried. These would then be sewn together to create a lightweight, startlingly waterproof layer, a kind of proto-raincoat or over-trouser. It wasn't breathable in the slightest. Wearing it was like being wrapped in a biological plastic bag. But it did an exceptional job of keeping wind-driven rain and snow from soaking the wool layers beneath. And let's be honest, no one was going to mock your fashion choices when you were clad in the internal organs of a large mammal and were the only one still dry and functional. Beyond the purely practical, the quality and type of your wool said everything about you. The average person wore coarse, undyed wool in various shades of sheep: browns, grays, blacks, and off-whites. It was itchy but effective. Wealth and status were displayed through softer, finer weaves, and even more powerfully through color. Imported dyes like madder root for red or woad for blue were expensive and highly prized. Wearing a vibrant blue cloak wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a walking billboard announcing that you could afford to waste resources on non-essentials. It was the Viking equivalent of wearing a high-end technical outdoor brand today. And nothing was wasted. A cloak was not discarded because it had a hole. It was patched. A tunic was passed down through generations, getting thinner and more threadbare, until it was finally cut down for a child, or its scraps were used to stuff a mattress or reweave into socks. A good woolen garment was a multi-generational investment, a family heirloom that had, quite literally, kept your ancestors from freezing. This wardrobe, this system of layered, greased, and sometimes gut-wrapped protection was what allowed a Viking to step outside the thermal embrace of the longhouse and face the world. It was portable shelter, a mobile microclimate of body heat that enabled them to work, travel, and ultimately to survive the countless journeys between the warm places in a very, very cold world. A Viking could be housed in the most ingeniously designed longhouse,
and wrapped in the finest, most layered woolens. But without fuel for the internal furnace, it was all just a slightly warmer coffin. The body is a machine, and in a sub-zero climate, that machine runs at a furious, calorie-burning pace just to maintain its core temperature. For the Vikings, food wasn't about pleasure or indulgence, it was insulation. Eating was a strategic act of survival. Their winter cuisine was a masterclass in preservation, calorie density, and aggressive practicality. You didn't just eat until you were full. You ate like your life depended on it, because quite frankly, it did. The entire rhythm of the warmer months, the spring, summer, and early autumn, was a frantic race against the oncoming frost to build up this edible fortress. Every activity was geared towards stocking the winter larder. This wasn't a matter of popping down to a market. This was a life or death calculation of how much you could save from the time of plenty to see you through the time of absolute scarcity. Let's start with the most abundant and crucial resource, the sea and the rivers. Fish was the staple protein, but a fresh cod in December was an impossibility. So the Vikings became absolute masters of fish preservation. They dried it, they smoked it, they salted it, and in a move that still gives the uninitiated pause, they fermented it. The most famous or infamous example is lutefish. This is whitefish, usually cod, dried to a board-like hardness. But then, in an act of culinary alchemy that borders on a dare, it is rehydrated in a solution of lye, yes, the same caustic substance used in soap making. This process breaks down the proteins, turning the fish into a gelatinous, translucent jelly. It was then rinsed thoroughly and boiled. The result is not delicious by most modern standards, but it was impressively immune to spoilage and packed with protein. It was food that could and did last for years. You ate it not for the taste, but for the simple, unyielding fact that it was there. But fish was just one part of the equation. Meat was a more precious commodity. Animals that couldn't be kept through the winter due to limited fodder were slaughtered in the autumn in an event known as the blot. This wasn't just a grim necessity. It was often a ritual sacrifice, thanking the gods for the provision and praying for their favor through the dark months. The meat was then preserved with the same ruthless efficiency as the fish. It was smoked in the perpetual haze of the longhouse rafters, salted in barrels, or air-dried to make a hard, jerky-like substance called skerpikchot. Every part of the animal was used, the blood for blood pudding, the offal for sausages, the bones for stock. Nothing was wasted, because every calorie, every gram of fat was a brick in the wall against starvation.
Dairy was the other critical pillar of the winter diet. Summer was the time of plenty for milk from cows, sheep, and goats. But milk sours, so they transformed it into stable, long-lasting forms. Butter was heavily salted and packed into barrels, sometimes even buried in peat bogs, where the cool anaerobic environment would preserve it for months, even years. Cheese was made not into soft, creamy bries, but into hard, salty, rock-like wheels. These were calorie-dense, fatty, and could be stored almost indefinitely. They were survival rations, perfect for chewing, for trading, for taking on long journeys. Then there was Skyr. Today it's marketed as a trendy Icelandic yogurt. In the Viking Age,
It was a staple food, a thick, strained dairy product, somewhere between yogurt and a very fresh cheese. It was incredibly high in protein, had a long shelf life, and its tart, sour flavor was a constant reminder of the harsh realities of their world. It was the culinary equivalent of a slap to the face, invigorating but confusing to the unaccustomed palate. Of course, a diet of pure protein and fat isn't sustainable. Grains provided the essential carbohydrates and bulk. Barley and rye were the most common, grown in small hardy patches where the soil allowed. This was not the flour for fine leavened bread. Viking bread was a dense, dark, hearty loaf, often baked as a flatbread on a griddle. Sometimes, in times of true scarcity, it was stretched with crushed tree bark, lichen, or even dried peas to make the precious grain last longer. It wasn't tasty, but it filled the belly and provided the slow-burning energy needed to stoke the metabolic fire. Porridge was a daily fixture, a thick, hot gruel of oats or barley that could be simmered for hours over the hearth, sometimes enriched with a dollop of skyr or a bit of saved fat. And then we must talk about the lubricant of this entire survival machine: alcohol. Ale and mead were not just for feasts and celebrations. In the winter, they were caloric beverages, a source of vital nutrients and comfort. The ale, brewed from barley, was low in alcohol by modern standards, but high in calories. Mead, fermented from honey, was a more potent and precious source of energy and inebriation. On a cold, dark night, when the wind was screaming and your toes had been numb for weeks, a horn of mead could make you forget, at least for a little while, that you lived in a smoky, crowded shed with your entire extended family and a few disgruntled livestock. It was a psychological and physiological buffer against the bleakness. And if it tasted rough, even better, no one would be tempted to steal your share. The winter meal, then, was often a grand, single-pot affair. A large iron cauldron would hang over the central hearth, and into it would go whatever was available: chunks of salted or smoked meat, dried fish that had been pounded back to a semblance of softness, root vegetables like turnips and onions from the storage pit, oats, barley, and whatever wild greens or herbs had been preserved. This stew would bubble away for the entire day, growing thicker and more concentrated. It was not glamorous, it was often monotonous, but it was hot, it was filling, and it stuck to your ribs with a tenacity that the cold couldn't easily overcome. It was communal, practical, and life-sustaining. In the deepest dark of the Viking winter, the greatest comfort wasn't a fancy meal, it was a full belly, because a full belly meant warmth, and warmth meant you would live to see the spring.
When the fire in the central hearth burned low, its embers casting only a faint dying glow, and the wind outside began to sound like a chorus of hungry wolves, the Vikings turned to their most ancient, reliable, and readily available source of heat: each other. And not just each other. In the stark calculus of winter survival, every warm-blooded creature was a potential furnace, a living, breathing component in a biological heating system.
The concept of indoors and outdoors, of human space and animal space, was a luxury that the Scandinavian winter simply could not afford. The longhouse, therefore, became a thermal collective, a single interdependent ecosystem where the boundaries between species blurred in the name of mutual survival. This was the most intimate and, to modern sensibilities, perhaps the most challenging aspect of Viking winter life. Bringing animals into the home wasn't considered odd or unhygienic. It was considered profoundly efficient. It was medieval central heating, powered by chewing, mooing, and bleating. The logic was impeccable and brutally simple. A large mammal generates a significant amount of body heat. A cow or an ox can produce as much thermal energy as a small contained campfire, and it has the distinct advantage of not requiring kindling, of being mobile, and of occasionally producing milk. In a world where fuel was finite and the cold was infinite, this was an opportunity too good to pass up. The architecture of the longhouse was often designed with this exact purpose in mind. Many longhouses, particularly those on farms, were built with an integrated byre, a stable area, at one end. This wasn't a separate building. It was a section of the same structure, usually separated from the human living quarters by nothing more than a low wooden partition or a simple change in floor level. This divider was symbolic more than functional. It was a suggestion of separation, not an enforcement of it. It kept a wandering cow from stumbling directly into the cooking fire, but it did nothing to stop the sounds, the smells, or the warmth from permeating the entire building. The animals housed in this section were the most valuable ones: the milk cows, the oxen used for plowing, a few goats or sheep. These creatures represented a family's wealth, their food supply for the coming year, and their traction power. Letting them freeze to death in an outbuilding wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an economic catastrophe that could doom the entire household to starvation long after the winter had passed. Bringing them inside was an act of profound pragmatism, protecting the family's capital in the most direct way possible. On a typical winter night, the scene inside the longhouse was one of cozy, if pungent, coexistence. The family would be on their raised sleeping platforms along the walls, buried under layers of wool and fur. Just a few feet away, on the other side of the low wooden wall, the livestock would be settled in their straw-lined byre, their large bodies radiating a steady, moist heat. The air would be thick with the scent of hay, animal dung, human sweat and wood smoke, an aroma that was probably as comforting to them as it is alien to us. It was the smell of life, of collective endurance. But on the coldest nights, the nights when the frost demons seemed to be scratching at the very walls, these nominal boundaries collapsed entirely. When the temperature inside the longhouse began to drop precipitously, the family might huddle closer to the byre, absorbing the radiant heat from the animals. Children, being smaller and more vulnerable to hypothermia, might be tucked into the straw next to a placid, warm-bodied sheep. If the family dog or cat crawled onto the sleeping platform, it wasn't shooed away. It was welcomed as a small, self-heating bed warmer. A warm ox was a better pillow than a cold one, regardless of the occasional snort or the smell of cud. It wasn't cozy in our modern sense of the word. It was profoundly effective.
This system was a masterpiece of low-tech energy efficiency. The body heat from the animals, rising naturally, would be channeled by the longhouse's low roof towards the human living areas. The building itself acted as a heat exchanger. The humans, in turn, provided the animals with shelter and protection from predators and the elements. It was a perfect, closed-loop, symbiotic relationship. The animals kept the humans from freezing, and the humans ensured the animals survived to produce more milk, more meat, and more warmth in the future. Of course, the side effects were significant. The noise of animals shifting, chewing, and vocalizing through the night was constant. The smell was omnipresent and potent. Sanitation was a perpetual challenge. The byre had to be mucked out regularly, and chamber pots used by the humans had to be carefully managed. There was always the risk of disease transmission between species, and the occasional kick or misplaced hoof was an accepted hazard of life. Yet there is no evidence that the Vikings complained about this arrangement. Their sagas and poetry are filled with boasts and stories, but not with lamentations about the lack of privacy or the rustic ambience. This is because they understood a fundamental truth that modern, centrally heated life has allowed us to forget. Warmth is not a given. It is a precious, hard-won resource. In the face of that truth, dignity and comfort become secondary concerns. The choice was not between a fragrant home and a smelly one. The choice was between a smelly, warm home and a clean, frozen corpse. This radical interdependence extended beyond the human-animal relationship to the heart of the family and community itself. The sleeping arrangements on the platforms were the ultimate expression of this. Parents, children, grandparents, and even servants all slept side by side, a tangled mass of humanity sharing body heat under a common roof of furs. There was no concept of a private bedroom. Modesty was a casualty of thermodynamics. The warmth of the collective was paramount. An elder's body heat was as valuable as their wisdom. A child's small form was nestled between adults for pure logistical insulation. It was a family-sized thermal battery, a survival cuddle that ensured the weak and the young had the best chance of seeing the dawn. In this way, the Viking home in winter was more than just a building. It was a single, warm-blooded organism. The people, the animals, the very structure itself were all part of an integrated system designed for one purpose: to preserve the fragile flame of life against the endless cold. It was a system built on a complete lack of sentimentality and a profound understanding of a simple, universal law of survival. Warmth now, dignity later.
The Vikings' strategy for surviving the cold was a masterpiece of brutal pragmatism. But every strategic victory comes with its own set of casualties and collateral damage. For all the life-saving warmth the Longhouse provided, it created a secondary, invisible battlefield within its own walls. The very methods that kept the frost at bay, the sealed environment, the perpetual fire, the crowded conditions, generated a suite of new enemies: toxic air, pervasive damp, and the constant looming threat of pestilence. Surviving the winter wasn't just about fighting the cold outside. It was about enduring the environment you had created to escape it. Let's return to the single greatest byproduct of their primary heat source: smoke. In theory, the design was sound. Smoke is hot, it rises. A hole in the roof, positioned above the central hearth, would allow it to escape, drawing fresh air in from below and creating a natural circulation. In practice, physics and architecture conspired to create living conditions that would be condemned by any modern standard. The smoke did not make a clean, efficient exit. It pooled under the thick sod roof, a swirling, acrid bank of haze that slowly, reluctantly seeped out through the thatch or the designated smoke hole. It was a lethargic, inefficient process. The result was that the longhouse was in a state of perpetual smog. The air was thick with particulates. You didn't just see the smoke, you tasted it with every breath. It stung the eyes, leading to chronic redness and watering. It induced a persistent, hacking cough, the Viking hack, as lungs worked tirelessly to expel the soot and tar. Over a lifetime, this constant low-grade exposure would have ravaged the respiratory system. The elderly, the very young, and those with pre-existing conditions would have suffered most, their shorter statures or weaker constitutions keeping them closer to the densest layers of this airborne grime. It's no exaggeration to say that the average Viking had the lungs of a lifetime coal miner by the time they reached middle age. And the smoke got everywhere. It coated the roof timbers in a thick, black, tarry layer that, in a grim irony, helped preserve the wood from insects and rot. It settled on every surface, on the sleeping furs, on the stored food, on the skin and in the hair of the inhabitants. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Vikings on the Volga River, noted with fastidious disgust their filthiness, comparing them to dusty asses. He was witnessing the direct result of this smoky environment. A Viking's distinctive scent would have been a complex bouquet of wood smoke, cured meat, damp wool, and human sweat, the perfume of survival.
But the smoke also had its uses, a classic example of a problem becoming a solution. The same smoky haze that damaged their lungs acted as a powerful preservative and pesticide. Meats and fish hung from the rafters were continuously smoked, becoming rock-hard and immune to spoilage. The smoke also deterred insects and mites, helping to keep the ever-present threat of lice and fleas from reaching truly biblical proportions. It was a trade-off they had no choice but to accept: respiratory health for preserved food and a modicum of pest control. Then there was the issue of humidity and sanitation. Dozens of people and animals breathing, perspiring, and existing in a tightly sealed space created an enormous amount of moisture. With minimal ventilation to avoid losing heat, this moisture had nowhere to go. It condensed on the cold walls, soaked into the earth floor, and dampened the bedding. This created a perfect breeding ground for mold and mildew, which would have contributed to a whole other set of respiratory ailments and skin infections. The longhouse was a damp, chilly place at its edges, no matter how warm it was at its center. Human waste was another critical logistical problem. The classic image of Vikings dumping chamber pots out of windows into the street is largely a medieval trope, and for a Viking farmstead in winter, it was an impossibility. Who would open a massive, heat-sucking hole in the wall just to empty a pot? Instead, they used chamber pots, simple buckets or ceramic vessels inside the house. These would be emptied at intervals, but at intervals could mean when the stench became unbearable, or when someone was brave enough to venture out into the killing cold. The waste was typically dumped into a designated midden or latrine pit located a short, but in winter perilous, distance from the longhouse. These pits were simple holes in the ground, sometimes lined with wood. In the frozen earth, the waste would not decompose. It would simply accumulate and freeze,
waiting for the spring thaw to create a truly spectacular olfactory event. For the men, a nighttime trip to the latrine pit in the depths of winter was a dangerous undertaking. It's easy to imagine the hurried, shuddering journey, the steam rising in the moonlight, the frantic return to the relative warmth of the smoky, crowded hall. For many, the chamber pot was the safer, if less sanitary, option. This constant indoor presence of human waste, even contained, contributed to the overall bacterial load of the environment. The straw on the floor, which absorbed spills, mud, and animal droppings, was supposed to be changed regularly, but regularly was a flexible concept when the fresh straw was buried under a foot of snow. The combination of poor ventilation, smoke inhalation, damp conditions, and compromised sanitation created a perfect storm for disease. While they didn't understand germ theory, the Vikings would have known that illness was more common in the winter months. Respiratory infections like pneumonia would have been a frequent and often fatal visitor to the longhouse. Gastrointestinal illnesses from contaminated food or water, or from poor hygiene, would have spread rapidly in the close quarters. A simple cut could easily become infected in such an environment. This was the grim, unspoken cost of their survival strategy. The longhouse, for all its life-saving warmth, was a hazardous environment in its own right. Every breath was a trade, inhaling life-giving warmth along with lung-clogging soot. Every cozy night spent nestled together was also a night spent in a petri dish of potential infection. They were constantly navigating a narrow path between two deaths: death by freezing outside and death by disease inside. Their resilience, therefore, wasn't just a matter of toughness against the cold. It was a testament to the ruggedness of the human body, its ability to endure and adapt to conditions that we would find intolerable. They survived not because their methods were clean or healthy, but because they were, on balance, just barely less deadly than the alternative. The unseen enemies of smoke, damp, and filth were a relentless indoor winter all their own.
You can engineer the perfect shelter, craft the most efficient clothing, and stockpile a mountain of food. But none of it matters if the human spirit inside that shell breaks. The Scandinavian winter was not just a physical siege, it was a psychological war of attrition. The unrelenting darkness, the sensory deprivation of a landscape locked in ice, the claustrophobic closeness of the longhouse, and the sheer grinding monotony of it all posed a threat as real as any frost giant from their sagas. To survive, the Vikings had to engineer their morale with the same ruthless pragmatism they applied to their physical needs. Their defense was a trinity of fire, steam, and ice, woven into rituals, stories, and a cultural mindset that viewed hardship not as a curse, but as a forge. The most powerful weapon in their psychological arsenal was light and warmth in its most concentrated symbolic form, the feast. The darkest point of the year, the winter solstice, was not a time of despair, but the epicenter of their winter celebrations. This was Yule, or Yule, a festival that stretched for days, sometimes even weeks. This wasn't mere merrymaking. It was a vital, communal morale operation, a deliberate and defiant act of joy in the face of the void. The Yule log was the literal and symbolic heart of this defiance. It wasn't a chocolate dessert. It was a massive, selected log, often of oak, that was dragged into the longhouse with ceremony.
It was then lit, and the goal was to keep it burning for the entire 12 days of Yule. This was a profound act of sympathetic magic. The log represented continuity, the enduring light of the sun, and the stubborn persistence of life itself. Letting it go out was a bad omen. Keeping it burning was a collective responsibility and a triumph. The great fires of Yule were roaring, defiant infernos that pushed back the darkness both outside and within. Feasting was the second pillar. This was when the carefully hoarded autumn bounty was brought out in generous, almost reckless portions. It was a calculated risk, a reminder to everyone that they were still alive, that they had prepared well, and that there was, for now, abundance. They ate the preserved meats, the dried fish, the hard cheeses, and drank the ale and mead not just for the calories, but for the message it sent. The act of communal eating, of sharing this hard-won wealth, reinforced the social bonds that were their ultimate insulation against despair. It was a loud, vibrant, and smelly declaration, "We are still here." Storytelling was the third pillar, the software that ran on the hardware of fire and food. In the flickering light, the skald or storyteller would become the most important person in the hall. They wouldn't tell gentle tales. They recited the sagas and the Eddic poems, epic stories of gods freezing to death heroically, of heroes facing impossible odds, of betrayal, loss, and grim humor. These stories were not an escape from reality. They were a reflection of it, but amplified. Hearing about Thor battling the frost giants or the heroes of old enduring endless winters made their struggle feel part of a grander, more meaningful tradition. It normalized hardship. It taught that suffering was not unique to them, but was the very stuff of which legends and character were made. The rough, dark humor that peppered these tales and their own daily interactions was a vital pressure valve. Mocking a cousin for a foolish mistake or telling a bawdy joke was a way to laugh in the face of the darkness, to assert their humanity against the impersonal cruelty of the cold. But their psychological warfare wasn't confined to the longhouse. In a move that seems almost contradictory, they actively sought out extreme temperature shifts. They had a deep cultural affinity for the sauna or badstofa. This was a small, separate hut, often built over a hot spring or heated with stones from the fire. Here, in a room thick with steam, they would sit, sweating out the grime and the tensions of the longhouse. This was not just about cleanliness. It was a ritual purification, a way to scour the spirit as well as the skin. Then came the real test. After working up a profuse sweat, some would run outside and plunge into a snowbank or a hole cut in the ice of a frozen river. This hot-cold shock therapy was a Viking hallmark. Why? On a practical level, it would have boosted circulation, shocked the system awake, and hardened the body. But on a psychological level, it was something far more profound. It was an act of dominance over the elements. It was a way to stare the very thing they feared, the paralyzing cold, directly in the face and prove through a voluntary, controlled encounter that they were not its victims. It was a ritual that screamed, "You cannot break me." This practice built a kind of psychological callus, a resilience that went deeper than muscle or bone. Underpinning all of this was a mindset, a cultural operating system that expected life to be hard. Norse mythology is not a comforting religion. It is filled with betrayal, doomed prophecies, and an ultimate end times, Ragnarök, that is a frozen winter called Fimbulwinter, followed by a final catastrophic battle where even the gods will fall. This was not a belief system that promised a happy ending. It was one that prepared you for a difficult journey. When your cosmology includes an apocalypse that begins with 3 years of endless winter, a few months of snow becomes manageable. This worldview bred a profound stoicism. Complaining was not just pointless, it was a sign of weakness. Endurance was the highest virtue. Children were taught this from birth. If your fingers were cold, you were told to use your elbows. If you fell through the ice and survived, you had a story to tell. There was no coddling because the world would not coddle them. This created a feedback loop of resilience. The community valued stoicism, so individuals strived to be stoic, which in turn reinforced the community's ability to endure. It was a culture engineered for survival, where a grim joke was a better weapon than a whine, and where the shared warmth of a story around the fire was as vital to their survival as the shared warmth of their bodies in the dark. They survived the coldest nights not just because they had fire, but because they knew how to feed the fire inside themselves.
We have journeyed through the Viking winter, from the smoky, animal-warmed intimacy of the longhouse to the psychological fortifications of Yule and the steam-filled Badstofa. We have seen how wool was layered, how food was preserved with ruthless efficiency, and how every breath was a compromise between warmth and lungful of soot. It is a picture of a people engaged in a relentless, daily calculus of survival. But to see these methods merely as a list of clever tricks for staying warm is to miss the profound, transformative truth. The winter was not just an obstacle the Vikings overcame. It was the crucible in which their culture was forged. The very traits that would define their explosive entry onto the world stage, their resilience, their pragmatism, their daring, and their deep-seated interdependence, were not inherited traits, but hard-learned lessons from the coldest nights of the year. Consider the longhouse. It was more than a shelter. It was a physical manifestation of a core Viking principle, the primacy of the community over the individual. The lack of privacy, the shared sleeping platforms, the collective body heat. This was a life that constantly reinforced the message that no one survives alone. The success of the individual was inextricably linked to the health of the collective. This same ethos is what powered the longship, a crew of rowers moving in perfect synchronized harmony was not a summer fling. It was a winter lesson applied to the open sea. The trust, the coordination, the shared purpose required to cross the North Atlantic were the same qualities honed in the dark, cramped confines of the winter hall. The man who could endure the snoring of his kin and the smell of his livestock without complaint was the same man who could endure the brutal monotony of an ocean voyage without mutiny. Their clothing and resource management tell a similar story. The Viking was a master of adaptation and making do with what was at hand.
They didn't have access to exotic materials. They had sheep, and so they became masters of wool. They had limited timber, so they built with turf. They had a short growing season, so they became unparalleled experts in preservation, turning summer's bounty into a year-round lifeline. This pragmatism, this ability to look at a landscape and see not its limitations but its potential, was a direct product of their environment. When they landed on the shores of England or France, they didn't see impenetrable forests or alien landscapes. They saw resources. They saw timber for ships, land for settlement, and goods for taking. The winter had taught them that the world does not owe you comfort. You must take what you need and engineer your survival from it. The longship raid was simply this principle, applied with violent ambition beyond their fjords.
Even their psychological makeup bears the frost's imprint. The stoicism required to face months of darkness without succumbing to despair. The dark humor that served as a shield against misery. The ritual embrace of the cold in the sauna and ice bath. These were not casual personality quirks. They were drilled-in survival mechanisms. This mindset produced a people who were not easily daunted. The prospect of sailing into the unknown, of facing a Saxon shield wall, of settling the frozen wastes of Iceland would have been terrifying to a culture accustomed to ease. To the Vikings, it was just another winter storm to be endured. The scale was different, but the emotional and psychological toolkit was the same. The man who could voluntarily plunge into an ice hole had already stared down a more intimate kind of fear. The warrior who believed the gods themselves were doomed to die in a final frozen battle was not likely to be intimidated by a mortal king. This is the ultimate legacy of the Viking winter. It was a relentless annual training ground that shaped every facet of their being. The infrastructure of survival, the long houses, the clothing, the food stores, was the hardware. But the software, the operating system of their culture, was written in the code of thrust and darkness. It taught them interdependence, a lesson that enabled both the tight-knit family farm and the coordinated warfare of the great heathen army. It taught them pragmatism, a skill that allowed them to build a ship one day and found a city the next. It taught them resilience, a quality that allowed them to fail, to be beaten back, and to return again and again. When the ice finally began to break up in the fjords, and the weak sun gained a little strength, the Vikings who emerged from their longhouses were not the same people who had entered them months before. They were leaner, harder, and hungrier. The winter had consumed their fat and their patience. It had left them with a burning need to move, to expand, to act. The confinement bred a desperate thirst for freedom and territory. The stored resources were depleted, creating a powerful impetus to replenish them through trade, exploration, or raid. The long ship, waiting on its rollers, was not just a vessel. It was the end result of a winter's worth of preparation and pent-up energy. The same hands that had patiently repaired tools by firelight now gripped oars. The same eyes that had strained to see in the smoky gloom now scanned the horizon for a new coast. The same community that had huddled together for warmth now rowed together
toward an uncertain future. They did not fear the journey, because the journey could not possibly be as long or as dark as the winter they had just survived. The North Sea's gales were just another wind they had learned to withstand. The unknown lands were just another landscape to be decoded and mastered. The Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year through a holistic system of technological, social, and psychological engineering, and in doing so, they inadvertently built the engine of their own expansion. They were not just survivors of the cold, they were its product. Forged in frost, they were sharpened to an edge that would, for a brief, brilliant moment, scratch its mark onto the face of the world. The winter was their greatest teacher, and the lessons learned in the darkness of the Longhouse enabled them to step into the light of history.
This legacy of winter is etched not just in their sagas, but in their very DNA, discernible in the archaeological record and the cultural memories of the lands they settled. The farmsteads of Iceland, the street plans of York, the legal assemblies of the Isle of Man, all bear the unmistakable imprint of a people for whom community was a non-negotiable survival strategy. The Thing, their form of popular assembly, where free men gathered to debate and decide law, was the political expression of the Longhouse principle. It was the understanding that collective decision-making, however messy, was stronger and more resilient than the fiat of a single, isolated ruler. It was the community engineering of the sleeping platform scaled up to the level of governance. We must also confront the darker aspects of this legacy. The same pragmatism that allowed them to use every part of an animal and weatherproof their boots with tar also allowed them to view human beings from other communities as resources to be exploited. The slave or thrall in the Viking longhouse was the ultimate extension of their utilitarian worldview. A thrall was another source of labor, another body that generated heat, another asset to be managed for the survival and prosperity of the household. The brutal calculus of the winter, where sentimentality could mean death, could easily be applied to human captives. The same culture that fostered profound interdependence within the kin group could justify breathtaking brutality outside of it. This was not a contradiction to them. It was a simple expansion of the same principle. Protect your own, use what you have, and take what you need to ensure your survival. The Winter's Forge also created a unique relationship with time and mortality. In a world where each winter was a gamble, where a bad harvest or an early frost could mean the end, a certain fatalism was inevitable. This is the root of the famous Viking courage in battle. Why fear the sword when the ice could claim you just as easily and with far less glory? The concept of weird, a sort of personal fate or destiny, was a comforting one. It wasn't a passive surrender, but an active embrace of one's lot. To die well with courage was to shape the story of your death, even if you couldn't control its timing. This mindset, born from the annual confrontation with a lethal environment, made them formidable opponents. They fought not because they believed they were invincible, but because they had already made their peace with death in a dozen different ways every winter. When we look at the full scope of the Viking Age, the lightning raids, the vast trade networks stretching to Baghdad, the settlement of empty lands, the dynamic art and storytelling, we are, in effect, looking at a pressure valve being released.
the interminable winter created a pent-up potential energy of ambition, skill, and restless energy. The summer was not just a season, it was an opportunity to convert that stored energy into kinetic action. The young men who took to the ships were the product of a system that had spent months honing their bodies, their skills, and their minds for a single purpose: endurance. They were simply applying that endurance to new frontiers.
The connection is direct. The shipbuilder who could craft a seaworthy vessel using axes and adzes was the same craftsman who could build a structurally sound longhouse. The navigator who could read the stars, the waves, and the flight of birds was using observational skills sharpened by a life spent reading the more immediate signs of weather and animal behavior for survival. The trader who could negotiate a deal for silver in Novgorod was employing the same shrewd assessment of value and need that was necessary for managing a winter's worth of finite resources back home. In the end, the story of how the Vikings survived the cold is the story of how they became the Vikings. The winter was the great silent partner in all their endeavors. It was the antagonist that forced innovation, the teacher that demanded resilience, and the filter through which their culture was strained and strengthened. It taught them that warmth is found in wool, in stew, and in the body of your neighbor. It taught them that light is not just a celestial phenomenon, but something you must create and defend with fire and story. It taught them that community is not a social ideal, but a thermodynamic necessity. So the next time you picture a Viking, do not see only the warrior on the deck of a ship, a silhouette against a summer sky. See also the figure huddled in the half-light of the longhouse, face smudged with soot, breathing the smoky air, listening to the wind howl, and waiting. See the patience, see the endurance, see the profound, hard-won knowledge that spring always comes, but only for those who are strong enough, clever enough, and united enough to deserve it. Their survival through the coldest nights was their first and greatest victory, a victory that preconditioned all the others. They were a people forged in frost, and the world felt the sharpness of that edge for centuries. This legacy of winter is etched not just in their sagas, but in their very DNA, discernible in the archaeological record and the cultural memories of the lands they settled. The farmsteads of Iceland, the street plans of York, the legal assemblies of the Isle of Man, all bear the unmistakable imprint of a people for whom community was a non-negotiable survival strategy. The Thing, their form of popular assembly, where free men gathered to debate and decide law, was the political expression of the Longhouse principle. It was the understanding that collective decision-making, however messy, was stronger and more resilient than the fiat of a single, isolated ruler. It was the community engineering of the sleeping platform scaled up to the level of governance. We must also confront the darker aspects of this legacy. The same pragmatism that allowed them to use every part of an animal and weatherproof their boots with tar also allowed them to view human beings from other communities as resources to be exploited. The slave or thrall in the Viking longhouse was the ultimate extension of their utilitarian worldview. A thrall was another source of labor,
another body that generated heat, another asset to be managed for the survival and prosperity of the household. The brutal calculus of the winter, where sentimentality could mean death, could easily be applied to human captives. The same culture that fostered profound interdependence within the kin group could justify breathtaking brutality outside of it. This was not a contradiction to them, it was a simple expansion of the same principle. Protect your own, use what you have, and take what you need to ensure your survival. The Winter's Forge also created a unique relationship with time and mortality. In a world where each winter was a gamble, where a bad harvest or an early frost could mean the end, a certain fatalism was inevitable. This is the root of the famous Viking courage in battle. Why fear the sword when the ice could claim you just as easily and with far less glory? The concept of weird, a sort of personal fate or destiny, was a comforting one. It wasn't a passive surrender, but an active embrace of one's lot. To die well, with courage, was to shape the story of your death, even if you couldn't control its timing. This mindset, born from the annual confrontation with a lethal environment, made them formidable opponents. They fought not because they believed they were invincible, but because they had already made their peace with death in a dozen different ways every winter. When we look at the full scope of the Viking Age, the lightning raids, the vast trade networks stretching to Baghdad, the settlement of empty lands, the dynamic art and storytelling, we are, in effect, looking at a pressure valve being released. The interminable winter created a pent-up potential energy of ambition, skill, and restless energy. The summer was not just a season, it was an opportunity to convert that stored energy into kinetic action. The young men who took to the ships were the product of a system that had spent months honing their bodies, their skills, and their minds for a single purpose: endurance. They were simply applying that endurance to new frontiers.